Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. We are here in the fourth conference on peace building from a gender perspective. We have this keynote conference, Restorative Processes in Family Matters and Support Circles for Women, organized by the International Institute for Restorative Justice and Law. And it's a pleasure to have with us our dear Violeta Maltos. She is an attorney, Autonomous University of Chihuahua. She's developed projects and training sessions on restorative justice in penitentiaries, adolescent center schools in 30 different federal entities in Mexico, as well as in 7 other countries of Ibero-America. She is Director General of the International Institute of Restorative Justice and Law in Mexico. Welcome, Violeta, and thank you so much for organizing this conference. It is my pleasure, Elvia. Thank you so much for inviting me. And what a pleasure to be here in this fourth Congress, although we do have such a difficult world situation, but this meeting continues. So we're so happy we can do it virtually. And in some parts of the conferences, well, everything is going to be in YouTube so that everyone can consult it later on. We can continue learning, we can make adjustments. So I want to thank you so much. And I congratulate the Ibero University for this great effort to continue in this conference, peace building from a gender perspective. We all talk about gender perspective, but do we really understand it? So this is a pleasure. This is a wonderful learning experience for all of us. And this is something we shall continue doing all our lives. So we need to always have new ways of looking at things and identify things that are very different from everything we were taught. Very well. In our conference, we have a consultant of the Institute, Claudia Villavicencio Guadarrama. She will be with us momentarily. And we are going to be projecting her presentation. But before giving her the floor, let me give you a context on restorative justice and what we are doing in Mexico, where she will be discussing on family restorative processes. This is really quite a novel thing. The sentence circles on family issues. Yes, my dear friend Hector and myself, we were looking into this issue, and we have different peace circles and circles for women. We know changes are necessary because we have to look at the sentence circles. And this is very good. We have written so many things on this. The state of Mexico is right at the forefront in family sentences. Let's talk about the context first on restorative justice as such. It's a very young issue, a young topic, although this restorative approach has been used since we came into this world, all of us, from different spaces. The theory of restorative justice is quite a young topic. We have not been writing about it for a long time yet. A lot of the authors started writing in the 70s with a paradigm case, and this was a restorative practice incorporated in a justice system. I'm talking about criminal justice system. So writing about restorative justice has implied bringing content from different disciplines and knowledge and expertise, sociology, criminal sciences, psychology, and many other disciplines. this construct and restorative justice is not unique, and some concepts are better known than others. But how do we conceive restorative justice? People are writing about it so much, and the concepts of it. Let me just mention four. Let me mention those, and later we shall hear from Claudia on the model that has to do with known concepts from Mexico, the paradigm. But to apply this in a cross-cutting manner with gender perspective, we have to do this, and we would have to include other issues like social movement. So first, let me go into life philosophy. So restorative justice as a life philosophy. I was just greeting my very dear professor, Vernon Jansi. He's with us. He was the first person that I heard talk about restorative justice as a philosophy of life. So how can I explain it better than he explains it? Well, restorative justice as a philosophy of life. Vernon explains it marvelously. Vernon Yancey, and there are also books on how in our everyday actions we can relate ourselves to other people, but to ourselves as well, with a restorative approach. So this is a dichotomy. This is what we read in stories since we are little, teaching us there are people that are bad, people that are good. If something happens, I mean, for the story to have a happy end, something bad has to happen to bad people. Those are the stories we heard when we were kids, and good people had to have a very happy end. That's how stereotypes are established. And this is very important, and good people end up married and happy. So this is a punitive way of looking at life. This is a matter of sectioning people, classifying people, and this comes from childhood. Childhood, everything we read. Restorative justice as a life philosophy seeks to find how we conceive ourselves, how do we judge ourselves, how do we relate to other people through this approach and understanding. We are good or bad. There are people making decisions. That's what we have. Some decisions, they're for the well-being of other people, and if they are for the well-being, they're also for our own well-being because we're all interrelated. And we also make decisions affecting other people. So this is like a rebound, and they affect us as well, negatively, I mean. So we have to avoid classifying people, not to say this person is bad or the other person is a good person. We have to see the decisions, how they affected others, how to do repair work. This is everyday actions. Now, restorative justice as a paradigm. Let me tell you what I think of this, the way I see it. How do I relate both? Paradigm. This is the best known restorative justice promoted rather by the UN, looking at justice and doing follow-up, looking for justice in different spheres, within the family structure, in juvenile criminal justice and human rights, among others. So this does not seek retribution, which is the punitive retributive paradigm, but that one based on sanctions, finding the culprit, and seeing the state as the affected part. And of course, this is like a banner through which the state acts, but in punitive or retributive paradigm, it's a matter of finding a culprit. The state is the victim. So the state has to sanction the culprit. Punishment is necessary in this case through pain. People are put in jail, and people have to pay a fine, money from their own pocket. So the restorative paradigm is based on relationships among people, not on the state as the affected party, no, but relationship among people, individuals, and the person who affected another person or persons. And there are causes or reasons for which that person has affected others. This is one of the essential elements of restorative justice, but not directly the person affected or the person affected directly. There are partners, friends, someone who suffers this affectation, this impact. And when a loved one harms someone, those that are close to us, the family, the relatives, the friends, especially if the person has to go through formal justice systems, we are all affected. And there's a second item here. It's people who depend on the context. Offenses, crimes affect everyone. But the affectation is bigger when it happens in a context close to us, in our community. If we are neighbors in that community, we are affected. In the school, we are also affected. If we are teachers or students, if this happens in our working space, if someone else is affected, if we realize someone is being insulted or fired with no justification, that is also affecting us. So what is restorative justice based on? On affectations of everyone involved. Who are the affected people? Needs that arise after this impact, and responsibilities and needs of everyone involved, directly or indirectly, the victim and people around the victim. But there are also responsibilities of the community and the person affecting the community. We have to understand the damage the person caused, and two, we have to carry out the necessary actions. Meeting with the affected person, is that necessary? Not necessarily so, because we can get people together. It depends on people's needs, not needs of the institution, not needs of the state in the justice system, but needs of the person. And this is perhaps the most difficult challenge. Responsibilities, that is understanding the damage I have caused and the repairing of that damage. Well, the framework is always very nice. It's not always implemented, but the integral repair framework is there with 5 elements. So then, this idea of justice as a paradigm, as a generalized idea, this is part of the UN system in Mexican legislation with restorative justice. The National Criminal Law for Adolescents has this context. The criminal execution law has restorative justice with alternative mechanisms, and it would have to have more, but this is not the case. Fortunately, there are other laws, but this is the way we understand the conceptualization. That is the way we conceive people, their relationship, their needs, their affectations, and how do we meet those needs? Not what I think they need, but we have to ask people, what do you need? And also seeking for responsibility of the community. This implies being responsible and making sure this doesn't happen again. This doesn't mean we have to repair the damage on the victim. We are not the person causing this damage. But what do we have to do so that this will not be repeated? Third, and this has great importance in terms of what Claudia will be talking about in terms of support circles for women and also family matters. Well, this has to do with the social movement. Experience of various commissions in the 90s in South Africa when Clerk won elections, how to heal all the pain. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was created. So restorative justice as a social movement, the best way to express it, Vania Davis has a metaphor in one of her books. She says, if we don't conceive restorative justice as a social movement, if we just stay in the paradigm part of all this, then we are going to be looking at it just from one angle. But what about the cause? We can look into the causes for the specific case, but not the reason that motivated the cause. All those inequalities, structural violence, cultural trauma, all those constructs and narratives we have generating inequality, and we can see any of the axis of inequality. Specifically, what Claudia will be referring to has to do with violence suffered by women and girls, because they are women and girls, and also LGBTQ community. But these inequalities prevail. If we don't conceive restorative justice as a social movement, and this is the metaphor of Fanias that I love, like a gardener, we are like a gardener. When a plant gets sick, he just wants to cure that plant, but he's not worried about soil and ecosystem conditions. When the plant is growing and the illness is right in the roots, then the soil is also part of the problem. So this is very much related. All three concepts are very much related. You can differ, but this is the first item where we personally know that how difficult it is to live in a restorative mode. This is the way we conceive justice everywhere, at home, in school, in communities and formal systems. And this right here means getting people involved in our formal systems. This leads to social movement. This has to be part of this one too. If we continue working only with the victim or the offender, in the best of cases, and this is regarding Mexico, we could find civil society organizations, but we are running short on this. If we don't look into the paradigm, taking the social movement into account, civil society organizations, and taking into account other voices, people who might make decisions, including the state, the state easily neglects its responsibilities. If this happens, we're just going to be staying the paradigm part. We cannot be separating these three. They have to be seen holistically. That's the way to see restorative justice as a social science. I will not go into detail on this, but you can see proposals that are made in different books, restorative justice, and some people see it as a criminal juridical science. It has to be seen as a social science, but there are authors like Virginia who talk about this in detail. This is the first framework. We would have to see that anything we do in all these three concepts with the three optics, these are the types of restorative processes. This is important when we talk about gender violence, understood as what girls and women suffer, and LGBTQ communities, recognizing not only international practice, but this is part of our criminal legislation and the one also for adolescents. Claudia will talk about it. She is the expert. There are two different types: those that imply a meeting of people or indirect communication, perhaps not face to face, but they do communicate through a facilitator. We have different models, and this is part of the law. And this is the meeting between the victim and the offender. Only the victim goes, and the person causing damage or harm after a legal procedure. And of course, if it's an adolescent, it's the tutor that goes, not only to guarantee superior interest, but also in terms of obligations the person may acquire, depending on what this meeting is taking place for. Restorative meeting, the family and the circles. There are many types of circles. I will go into this. Claudia will talk about those types of circles. The sentence or harm circles. The sentence and or harm circles, according to the criminal execution law. And here, then the victim and the offender meet, or there's a communication done through different means. We also have individual programs that have greater application if we did what the law says we should do. They are in criminal execution. It is the obligation of the penitentiary authority, and for adolescents of the administrative authority. This law was published in 2016. But individual programs are always a possibility. What does this mean? Claudia will explain it from the classification done on types and practices that are completely restorative, but we can work on this individual programs based on other principles and values of restorative justice. People who have offended without there being victims, or the people that were affected do not have to be there. We can just work with the offenders. This is a label, of course, but it is very used. The person causing the affectation or working only with the community. We have a program thanks to a marvelous organization called Documenta. They helped create an organization called CAIFAN for relatives of people going through jail, people who are in jail. So this organization is working on a 6-month program, 2 Sundays a month, 3-4 hours through circles. That's why the circles are so important, talking about the affectation at the individual family levels and organizational, and how everyone is suffering because someone is in jail, someone in their family. We also have programs where we can work with offenders and the community, relatives, friends. This is mainly with teenagers. We have a program with working with the adolescents and the family. This is a 4-month program, and we talk about the crime and the impact on the family, what is working, what is not working, what they need, which is the family dynamic, the violent dynamic, hurting family members, which are those traumas generated hurting the person, him or herself, or offending others, thus having victims. So at the end, we're working separately with the teenager and family, and then we get them together through family commitments. And we also have circles just for victims. You see the enormous margin here in which we have cases and people stay at that unit and everything is just put in a file and no one takes care of the victim. No one cares for the victim. All this grief, all this identification of needs was never done. Perhaps someone went to talk to the public prosecutor or the police, but person was not treated as a human being. No one heard what the person had to say to heal the problem, where the person wants to go for the healing process. And then we have victims and community. How many communities do we have in Mexico where people suffer home robbery, car theft, and no one is ever found? So no one cares for the victim. The person suffers and neighbors because they're waiting to see when their turn will come for the next assault or robbery. So generally, I think I'm always saying the same thing, but let me explain that we conceive restorative justice. And Claudia will talk about this idea. We limit restorative justice. Forget about restorative practices, conceiving restorative justice, not in these marvelous ways, but the victim and offender. We believe that's the limit. There are many ways to enforce this, depending on the person, the case, depending on what we talk to this person about and the person's needs. We want to give them voice and decision making power. Where is it that they want to walk to go to? So at the beginning, we do not know if this will imply a different process. We have to talk to people. Maybe the person does not want to meet with the offender. So the restorative part would be convincing and sitting this person with the offender. Do we think that's restorative? We might think it is, but the most restorative part is listening to the victim. And then the peace circles. And then I will show Claudia's video where she talks about her model. And then she will come and be here with us for your questions. There's a lot of confusion on the circles of peace and their types, especially circles for adolescents, but there are many circles and possibilities for their use. Some are restorative circles. Others perhaps have nothing to do with restorative justice, but they help us to improve relations, to continue moving forward in restorative justice as a philosophy of life. and in terms of affectations as well. On the victims, the peace circles are called that way because of three very important people in this conception of the circles. One of the authors from Canada and another professor who has come to Mexico to be with us, not only in classrooms, and Mark Wedge, head of the First Nations, who's played a very important role for the evolution of the model. And the judge started asking at the end of the 90s, those sentences, how restorative are they? And also for the victim and the person accused more than simply for the state. So with Mark Wedge's help, we started learning about original people's models, sentence circles. Well, what are they? Everyone is, well, of course, accused, victims, families, police, prosecutors, defenders, and defendants included. So more than one person participating in the circle. The community in the circle made the decision, not only one person. So this is a vision that will never be able to include all the collective needs, but the collective itself looking into that or doing it. Then at the end of 91, beginning of 92, that was the first sentence circle. This is in a beautiful book called Peace Circles. Those three authors started seeing circles good for many things, not only for sentences or convictions. So they decided to change the name to Peace Circles, which is more generic, and the conviction or sentence circles are just one circle. This opens a new methodology applied with different objectives, and in some cases with longer preparation process, more elaborate process on various circles. We have celebration circles to honor a person, an event. This can be used here in the Institute. We have the celebration circle for birthdays, for Christmas. We have dialogue circles. In the Institute, we've had many dialogue circles there in our Facebook page. In these dialogue circles, people share certain issues, not to reach any agreement, just for the sharing of their experiences. We have support circles to accompany a person or group of persons in a difficult moment. Now with COVID-19, the Volunteers Institute, twice a week, we have support circles for institutions. We've been working with the prosecutor's office right now because people have died. The employees have died. So we want them to be able to express the consequences of COVID and to accompany those people. And we want to see what's working for them so that we can have hope as a group. Healing circles, seeking to help a person suffering a loss for the healing process, for the resilience process, learning circles. Those of us that are teachers may use these circles for some issues or inviting an expert. And through the circle, that knowledge is assimilated and shared so we can all build. The decision making circle doesn't necessarily have to do with a conflict. Yes, when we saw so many online courses, we had this decision making circle. And we have community development circles. A group of people, a working group, a task force, a group of neighbors can get to know this better without any previous conflict. And we also have conflict solving circles. This is a very important circle, and this is part of the sentence circles. And this circle, people with differences can get together to talk about their difference and solve their conflict. They can find collective solutions, community solutions, sentence or conviction circles. Claudia will tell you about the sentence circles. They were designed for criminal issues. However, they're also applicable in other environments. At the family level, Claudia was the first one that started doing this at the family level. And we have reintegration circles. A person who was perhaps in jail, a person who was victim of a crime, and a person that's being stigmatized, a victim with stigma. And in the case of women, this is a complicated thing because these people are victims, but their families are judging them as well. So this person should be part of community. That's what the circle is for. And damage repair circle. This is when damage is caused on an individual or a group of people. We have to see how the person has been affected and how we can repair this damage or harm. So we have many circles. And the learning circle or the community development circle, perhaps we work with families of people in jail. So we make combinations and adolescents also in special centers. That's what we design special programs for. And gender violence. This is cross cutting. We find it in all the spaces. And we can find it normally in terms of family violence crime. But sometimes this could take place without gender relations. Any other crime could have been committed with gender perspective, threats, robbery. So family violence and gender violence are two different things. But before we go into restorative justice, let me tell you that all the spaces and environments with human interaction are spaces where we can practice restorative practices, processes, programs with restorative justice. We have the integral system for criminal justice for adolescents. We have criminal issues for restorative justice through an alternative mechanism in terms of problem solving or settlement of conflicts. And there are some restorative processes where this is like a alternative mechanism. We have the institutional, the entrepreneurial, the business, affectations of staff or personnel. Instead of suspending someone, instead of firing, something we can use alternative. We can also use this at the school level. And we can also practice restorative measures. For instance, where there's bullying in a school, if we find the offender and the victim, it's school violence, and we can apply restorative practices. A lot of the cases in schools that we get in the adolescence criminal system, the system cares for the victim, the adolescent, and also the offender with participation of the families, but the classmates who's witnessed violence are never cared for. Only communities are cared for. And the community environment is very important. There are many initiatives. We started with the one in Morelia, and in Chihuahua, we're applying some circles at the community level, also at the labor level, and in human rights. This has already been formulated in the Human Rights Commission of Mexico City, July 12, 2019. There we already have restorative justice and transitional justice for this. Instead of my telling you about it, I am not a specialist on transitional justice. I'm learning about it whenever we've had other cases seeking strategies to recover after an armed conflict, for instance. This is a crossing between restorative approach, but not only that, but also applying restorative practices. Here we have a dialogue circle of transitional justice by experts. We can give you the link of those people explaining it in great detail. And we have the family matter. Restorative processes for families, Claudia explains this marvelously and in a very clear fashion. Anyone can understand the way she explains it, even people with no law disciplines or knowledge. She explains it saying that that's the way justice would have to be. In reality, justice is for people, not only for us. At the family level, mediation was the only thing applied, but in some cases, mediation is no good. Not only that, if we don't have a gender perspective, this it can re-victimize people, and this is a very dangerous thing to happen. So Claudia has developed models. That's what this conference is about. You have the links right here, and you have the email of my institute. You can find dialogue circles. So thank you so much for allowing me to make this introductory comments. Now I invite you to see the video and all the different circles and concepts of restorative justice and the types of circles. I want to show you Claudia's work and how she's applying it at the family level. Thank you. I will be staying here with you. Let's watch the video, please. Jorge? Thank you. Hello, friends. I'm Claudia Villavicencio. First, I want to thank Ibero University for allowing me to be sharing this with you in the framework of this marvelous conference. I want to talk about restorative practices in the framework of family restorative justice with a gender perspective. I also want to thank the International Institute of Restorative Justice and Law and everyone for giving me this very important opportunity to be able to share with you, opening the paradigm of restorative justice with an approach which is not the criminal one, an approach that looks at the family scenario. And on this opportunity, open this paradigm to a possibility of implementing gender perspective on restorative justice in the family circle through restorative practices, collaborating so that we may materialize gender perspective. Let me start out sharing with you a restorative justice model for families that I was able to design through my experience with facilitators working with families, and some practices mainly focused on gender perspective and supporting women, as well as support circles that may be developed within this restorative family justice process. So let me start my presentation, and I want to share with you this model. So then, let me start out sharing this with you. This is the model I was able to develop. This is a family restorative justice model, opening the door to this restorative paradigm before the traditional approach we know of criminal issues, or opening the path at the school or community levels. It is extremely important for us to place our eyes on the family's approach, because it is the family scenario with so many stories of family violence where the victims are women, and they are the victims of the circumstances of violence in the family environment. It is very important for us to place our interest, our eyes on this perspective, so that from this family scenario, we may pay attention and use our experiences and restorative practices, collaborating to generate a nonviolent environment for women. So let me start out sharing this restorative justice, this family model, including the philosophy of restorative justice, as this philosophy based on looking at damage, at harm done in any environment or under any social perspective. This is a model for those types of harms, to heal harm, to repair, to alternative means, to care for victims. This is definitely centered on damage and harm. In this family restorative justice model, we are going to look at the processes, how they are developed at the family level with a gender perspective. I will share with you practices we've developed focused on this. Within the model, in the judicial environment, we have to remember important restorative practices in the spectrum we can develop. And we have formal practices like the conviction or sentence circles, where we are looking at the gender perspective in this type of circles, always being very cautious not to re-victimize, not to repeat violence, and to have gender perspective for women with gender equity, supporting women and vulnerable groups and teenagers, superior interest of minors with this gender outlook. And we have an important element that means making processes effective. This multidisciplinary approach allows us uh, to see it in an integral manner. And I want to share with you how this multidisciplinary outlook is used. Restorative justice has cross-cutting elements under this model and perspective to support, and this is done through restorative practices in circles for women, through philosophy, values, and this is our compass for this model. In the model, we have programs that have a specific purpose with very clear goals, and the target audience, and how often these circles are going to be implemented, exactly to look at support circles for women promoting gender perspective. Social capital is also of the utmost importance in restorative justice, because the social capital has to be effective to produce effectiveness at the social level, where we are all responsible for everyone else. Thus, we look at building public policies, generating well-being with social scope for everyone, men and women. Now, let me share with you this that I think is extremely important. There are important ordinances in Mexico and at the international level prohibiting the use of alternative problem-solving methods where women are victims of violence. And this is due to this alternative methods, reconciliation and mediation, also have possibilities of having people on a level playing game or table of discussion. But the defenders and the victims, are they the same? That's why alternative problem solving means are looking into this type of issues, because sometimes they re-victimize the victim. So why talk about restorative justice with a gender perspective for this type of issues? Because the assumption is that this is not a leveled dialogue table. There are differences between A and B. A is the victim, B is the offender. It is necessary to present this approach through this accompaniment, and sometimes this is not done through reconciliation because of the principle of neutrality. So we have these alternative methods to facilitate dialogue and understanding, but this principle cannot show accompaniment to give this possibility of not re-victimizing the person. So the assumption is that in these cases, there is asymmetry because we have victims and offenders. They cannot be treated the same on a level dialogue table. That would imply a very high risk for re-victimization. So we are facing cases where we have asymmetry caused by damage caused or the harm that was caused by the offender. So we are considering in this model that this is focused on restorative justice models, taking into account the harm being caused on the person. One is the victim, the other one is the offender. Under this asymmetry, we cannot talk about mediation and reconciliation because it needs accompaniment that cannot take place here because of this asymmetry. However, under the perspective of this, there's a facilitator, and this facilitator can accompany, and this is not the role of the facilitator because there's neutrality, limited neutrality, and the protagonist of these processes is always the victim. And this is mainly looking into the victim needs. That's the main thing, and interest derived from the harm or damage, the consequences of the attack. Why is this applicable to look into gender perspective cases? Because we have this accompaniment of restorative justice to be with the victim as the protagonist and center of the processes. We have limited neutrality by the facilitator that can accompany the victim. So then under this restorative justice model for families, we are definitely repairing the damage at the family environment. So you will clearly understand how this works in my presentation. From here, we can go into restorative practices in the family scenario. Well, as I was telling you, within the design of the model I'm talking about, we have philosophy of restorative justice. When we apply this type of practice, we have a sound basis with the pillars of restorative justice through identifying harm and needs caused by the offense, the obligations therein, and who should be taking care of this, as well as the participation of everyone looking into this type of offenses at the family level. And we also have the participation of all those that are necessary and important, so that under this gender perspective, we can develop restorative practices that will empowering, revaluing, and pushing women to a different social perspective from the family environment. Values of restorative justice fundamentally are part of these possibilities to develop practices such as equality, tolerance, transparency, respect, and solidarity. And here, sorority. This is another value we would add under this perspective of restorative justice applied in this type of practices of support for women. It's also very important to share with you, to tell you that this model is based on the theory of complex thought, not only on the systems theory. When we talk about understanding this conflict at the family level, commonly we talk about the systems theory, thinking that the family is a system and subsystems. But the complex thought theory includes more than that. We see the family as a system, and this family has subsystems that may be comprised of the parental focus, the parents, the fraternal one, the siblings, and the filial, and the spouses. And we also consider this family as a system that's in interaction with other systems, schools, the environment, work, jobs, and friends. So the family, just like jobs, schools, and friends, are part of a macro system, a supra system, where we are all participating. This is the community or society. However, it is important for us to have this theory of complex thoughts through the systems inside the family and the interaction those subsystems have with other social subsystems and the way we're all related. But we also have to see at the conflict, not only the impact inside the family, but also this interaction among the subsystems and systems inside and outside, and the impact they have on all of us, especially because there's multi-diversity of social relations and social connections that take place through these relations. And it's exactly there where complexity arises. So that's why there's an expectation in terms of the systems theory, but the complex thought theory that we use to show the impact of this damage at the micro and macro levels in the system. So restorative justice in this perspective is a response, an evolved response for family well-being, and this is the evolved response for family well-being. This constitutes this type of response, evolved because it's according to possibilities and needs, but especially to social reality in our societies, especially in Latin America. Under this new plural concept of the family, we have this perspective of restorative justice, considering this very important axis of gender perspective, masculinities, the different types of families, and shared rearing process. To understand the possibility and the need of developing practices like this support circles for women. I will share this with you later on. Under this lens of gender perspective, avoiding re-victimization and socializing those women who have been victims of these types of violence, and also doing this from the primary nucleus in the society, the family. And this approach of the rearing process, a shared process, it's necessary to look into different family restorative justice issues. I will share this with you later on, the success story that I'm going to be sharing with you. This has to be with rearing a child, leading to victimization and re-victimization of women from the role they have in terms of their gender within the perspective, saying that we women can all be there to bring up our children, and that's a stereotype under which we are victimized because of our gender. We are in charge of the children, and part of this democratic approach of restorative processes and this associative focus, we have to get the parents involved, the fathers, through new masculinity schemes in terms of affection, and fathers can also play this role in the family so that obviously we can reduce and do away with this type of social practices victimizing women from this gender stereotype under the approach saying that women are the ones that have to bring up the kids because of their gender. So what do we have to do with this? We have a spectrum of restorative practices we can develop as part of this model using informal practices. And within the informal practices, we can develop effective declarations. And from there, we promote restorative justice at the family level with nonviolent communication. It's important to consider that the facilitator should have specific training to help people use this nonviolent communication model. Step one, the facilitator would have to model this type of nonviolent communication with the purpose of using this pedagogical perspective in restorative processes for people to understand and learn to communicate in a non-violent manner. So families within this dynamic have normalized violence, and gender violence is highly normalized in Mexican families. So from this informal practice, we start promoting nonviolent communication. It is possible for those informal practices to start breaking away from the paradigm of normalizing violence because of gender issues. It's also possible that within this spectrum, we have restorative questions as part of a restorative dialogue. They will always be centered on repairing damage and harm and the situation of the affected persons. In this restorative approach, we can implement with families restorative spontaneous meetings, peace circles, dialogue circles, sentence circles as formal practices, and the state of Mexico is one of the pioneer entities in Mexico. I had the opportunity of facilitating the first sentence circle in Mexico for family issues. There is no doubt that this opened my perspective on the number of practices and programs we can develop with this restorative approach and with this gender perspective. We also have restorative meetings, family group meetings that are part of formal practices. Which are the focus we can have? Which are the types of focus we can have? We have the preventive focus or approach. We don't have to wait for a claim to be filed. We don't have to wait for a trial. We don't have to have a victim of family violence, a woman victim part that is suffering this that is being violated by this social spectrum. We also have the reactive approach with restorative practices as a way to looking into the harm caused. And we also have restorative processes that may be developed within this restorative justice at the family level with a gender perspective. What are we promoting in this program, in this model and practices? Well, the restorative approach decision making. That is in terms of formality and judicial environments through sentence circles, for which we have also the state of Mexico experience with 13 jurisprudences on this with restorative practices, looking into the harm caused and identifying it first. And in this case, the sentence circles right at the top of family restoration process. This means that it's not a thing that happens suddenly as a mediation process. This is not just having circles per se, saying this is restorative justice. There are many conclusions, many opinions on this. I have seen that many people, and the fact you sit people in a circle, they think that's a restorative circle, or they develop mediation processes without looking at the restorative approach. And they want to create these circles and call it restorative justice. Although it is true the mediation has therapeutical effects on people because the fact that people are listened to produces a healing process in them. It is not the same for restorative approach. So we have to be very cautious when we talk about formal practices like the sentence circles or the support circles for women, because we cannot refer to them as an isolated practice that we are congratulating or commending because we think this is what has to be done. However, this could lead to re-victimization, and this could also lead to our making mistakes whenever we want to call or classify this type of practice as restorative, but they are really not that. And then we also run the risk of taking the virtual purpose of restorative justice and also deforming its use and going back to placing people in a high risk scenario for re-victimization. So this is part of the restorative approach, and the circle can be the main part of this when we talk about center circles. When we talk about support circles for women, these circles are part of all this restorative approach done in a restorative justice family type of solution with the participation of the family justices, attorneys, facilitators, multidisciplinary teams, community teachers, family support networks, and different institutions. And the sentence circles for restorative justice in this restorative approach. We have the family restorative circles with three different important ramifications. The legal one, because we have the superior interest of the minor, we have the gender perspective and human rights. We have the psycho-emotional access because we're emotional people and we reason. In this restorative approach, we have to remember there is this psycho-emotional access for us to have the right approach. And we have the human social access. As I have explained, this has an impact not only inside the family, but also outside the family in terms of what the community represents. And we have a fourth access, which is the educational one under this pedagogical approach of the restorative justice model with the family and a gender perspective. Here I want to share with you this phrase that I've developed as of the experience I've had as a family facilitator as well. Circles done as part of a restorative process in the family show human quality at the surface of justice with the human quality in justice systems because they're focused on the person and they are models using the person right at the center of all this. Because if we continue working just with one access for people, we're talking about other types of violence, of women, structural violence, when as a victim, well, what happens is as part of a judicial process, the family level, these women have to show that they were victims. And how do they do that? This is also a re-victimizing role. So what about opening these restorative practices for this gender approach? And this has to do with many women who went to the mediation room and they told me that they needed a way to reach an agreement after so many problems they had at the criminal and family levels trying to show they were victims. And also as a consequence of that, a sentence had not repaired absolutely anything of the damage they had suffered. So they were not even closer to repairing the damage generated in the family environment. Because when we talk about family violence and violence suffered by this woman and their family, we have to remember that in this violence approach that's generated, those family ties are not broken from one moment to the other. The offender may even throughout his lifetime be linked to the victim because he's the father of those children. So how do we stop this from happening? The offender has caused so much damage and harm on the mother of his children. And the sentence, does it really manage for the alimony to pay for the children's maintenance and support? And what about the damage against the family? What about this woman with all the harm and the harm on her children as well? So the criminal family process are not enough to believe that under that perspective we can really repair damage. So then we have to look at this approach so that families may build agreements with the support of a judicial system with solutions that are tailor made according to their needs and according to the impact on their lives, because it's not just solving the problem, the healing process is the most important part. And we also have this multidisciplinary approach in this model, but the importance of generating this multidisciplinary perspective, this will allow us to approach the conflict under a diversity of lenses with different social science dimensions, facilitators, psychologists, and also social workers, teachers, and gender perspective psychologists. Because if we add all these perspectives in this restorative approach, this will allow us to stop damage the best way possible without limiting just the work of a facilitator, but having the participation of other professionals for a multidisciplinary team participating in restorative justice. This has to do with restorative processes because they are the ones that can do this. And this will be part of this in the different social sciences, mainly to identify and look into the damage caused under a perspective where we can map the conflicts beyond what we can see from the possibility or interest of the persons, but going deeper to see where the damage was caused. So it is extremely important to have this approach for us to identify damage. Now, on various occasions, people were asking me as facilitator when I'm sharing these experiences, people say the systems or institutions are limited to generate a multidisciplinary team that will be identifying damage or harm. What do we do? Do we deny the process? Do we deny the possibility? Do we close the door? That will be re-victimizing the person. We have to look at it as structural manner to generate a possibility in which, if there is no possibility of having this multidisciplinary team, we have to give the facilitator training and expertise based on social sciences for them to develop the psychological part, the gender perspective, the pedagogical aspects to be used in this restorative approach for comprehensive practices. Within this process of identifying damage, we find wounds from childhood that trigger gender violence. From childhood, we women have been violated in the way we are treated in the family scheme as daughters, sisters, or wives. And thus, we have emotional wounds as rejection, abandonment that come from our parents, or even just because we're women. And this situation has to do with gender roles. Humiliation is also there from the woman's perspective. We can be victims right of the family. Treason is also very important. And this is something that starts at the family environment because treason generates a wound in which we women lose trust on people, relationships. As of that point in our adult life, we may build harmful relations, destructive relations based on this sense of having lost trust and credibility. And we don't want to be abandoned or rejected because we have already been victims of that. And in our adult life, if we didn't understand this, when we are adults, we don't understand it. We want to get away from those wounds, so we accept toxic relations. Don't reject me, don't betray me, don't abandon me. That's what we say. And this starts at the family when we are little girls. And injustice or rigidity through patriarchal authoritarian schemes we're victims of. So, under all this approach, the gender perspective starts with ourselves. This is something I want to convey to you today. This gender perspective is extremely important for us to permeate it at all levels, social, institutional, legal levels, and everything that we can do at the community level. Let us not forget the main one, born within ourselves. This perspective has to come from us, from the perspective of the way we see things, our faith, and also trusting ourselves and our self confidence. This is something we cannot allow for those wounds in our childhood to continue defining our lives and placing us in different victims' positions as sisters, as wives, and mothers. So, this gender perspective has to be coming from us in our capacity of resilience and the possibility of opening restorative practices, supporting this woman in the path of fixing and curing this harm comes from the father, the mother, the siblings with a family perspective. This may happen in childhood, but it's very important for us to break away this from this in our adult life. And this is the only way we can break this chain of harm. And we're not repeating stories or violence patterns in the families we create or form. So we're breaking chains. So we're breaking violence patterns. That's what this family restorative processes are all about. And for that, we have restorative practices considered as a comprehensive part, like a toolbox, allowing facilitators and this multidisciplinary team to develop the right restorative approach. It's also important to permeate identification of harm and needs under this restorative perspective for us to have a restorative process that will really be according to needs. And also identifying harm and needs. We can then implement various techniques using psychology, for instance, and gender perspective, human rights, pedagogical elements, and social work. For that, it's important for facilitators to have the necessary training to identify learning channels of people who are participating in a restoration process so that then our practices are focused on those channels through which those victim women can express harm on them and their needs. I've had women who cannot express this verbally. This has to be done through poems. They express it through manual work and handcrafts and many other expressions. So these are the learning channels. This is extremely important. We have to take them into account in the way we can approach restorative processes, accompaniment, and follow up. This is very important, allows us to measure the compliance of the agreements with a gender perspective. It allows us to do the follow up to know exactly how much we're reconnecting this woman with her family social environment. For this, we have restorative practices that may be partially restorative, not for everyone. We want to get involved, but we're not limiting people who are victims. We cannot just say, well, why the offender doesn't want to participate, therefore we cannot develop restorative practices. It doesn't work that way. Whenever there's someone missing, we can still do this restorative practices, and the totally restorative practices when everyone involved is participating. So in these restorative practices, we have circles and panels, and we have a clear objective and the purpose of those circles or panels. We can find school for parents, masculinities, women empowerment, feedback, family recognition, and mirror circles that I will share with you as part of the success story. Effective social capital allows us to expand the paradigm of restorative practices. These victim women should be cared for by an institution plus restorative accompaniment. So we have to have the institutions to look into this type of damage, and we have to have this participation for this woman to get at a certain point psychological help, shelter, among other services. So this is mainly focused on family well-being, public policies. So let's talk about support circles for women. These are restorative practices of the mirror modality to generate in participants. And we generate very important aspects, for instance, sense of identity. I'm not alone. There are other women like me who are going through the circumstances in which they have felt victims as well. So accompaniment coming from these mirror circles is fundamental because it's these women who give feedback, who relate to each other, they accompany and support each other. So these are the marvelous restorative circles that reinforce this sense of community and belonging, where victim women have lost because of violence. And this means also fundamental elements and values with gender perspective, like sorority. This is support we give each other, that we identify ourselves and we help each other to break away from schemes and paradigms, but doing it from ourselves. So those schemes have to do with social cultural context, and they give the meaning of being a woman, a mother, and also being a good person. So this is something where our that many are using to re-victimize and to take our personality away. And they say this is a bad or good person. So this is some of the things that I found as part of approaching those mirror circles as part of the family restorative process. I had four restorative processes in which they had a characteristic. women participating in these restorative processes were women that had no custody over their children, and they were re-victimized. Aside from the violence they were suffering in the family since childhood, and then the family they formed. Now they were being re-victimized by these stereotypes and forms of understanding, bringing up their children and understanding what it meant for them to be a mother. So these women reflected damage in their lives, how they were being stigmatized, classified by society because they didn't have their children under their custody. You are a good mother if the children are under your custody. But if you do not have custody of your children, you're not a good mother. This is a very harmful social construct. So the role of the women and using words and many terms against this woman in these mirror circles, phrases like not even dogs leave their children, not even dogs leave or abandon their children. And this was generating a sense of rejection in women of the children against their mother, saying, you have a bad mother, she abandoned you, she's not a good mother. She doesn't love you. If she loved you, she would be here with you. She's not honoring her role as a mother. So the consequence that the children were rejecting their mother, more victimization, and then the sense of abandonment. This sense of abandonment from mothers to children, I had the opportunity of working through this family restorative approach, the children who had a tremendous sense of abandonment because of this type of stigma generated and normalizations of violence in which children were said, you don't have a good mother because she abandoned you. So this generated in children this sense of abandonment. Later, what happened was that children suffered this in childhood and they replicated that when they were adults. So this is the eternal return. This is the eternal circle. What other things did we work on in this mirror circle? Accompaniment, identity, sorority, power, revalorization, and empowerment. These are some of the photographs of those circles. I have the authorization of these very brave women. They were participating in a family restorative process. They became facilitators. This for women went through this process with their family, parents, and children. They participated in the mirror circle, getting elements of sorority, empowerment, and identity. Through this circle, we placed right at the middle those conditions that felt us, that made us feel supported and accompanied. We recovered important elements of these women bringing up their children. These women had no custody over their children, so we started looking at schemes of victimization, and they thought they were bad mothers, and they had this feeling of guilt. Effects and results of this women's support circles through the restorative process. We were breaking away from paradigms generated because of culture and society, the gender role, and from this perspective of not being good women, good mothers, because they didn't have their children with them, displacing men and the possibility and the obligation they have of getting involved affectionately in bringing up their children. And with this, obviously, striking a balance on the burden, restoring emotional wounds, rejection and abandonment between mothers and children. For a mother, her children will always be important, and she does not want to feel rejection or have the children feel that they were abandoned by her. These are social stereotypes and also re victimization. This is something we looked into through schemes of normalizing violence. When violence is normalized, women are aware of the damage they are victims of. This embodies perceptive of gender from the woman's side. Well, that's my presentation. I'm Claudia Villavicencio. I have a space for you through my Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter pages and YouTube. I've been able to share some chats with gender perspective and breaking away from paradigms of violence. You can write me there, and this is where you can find me. I will be with you later on, sharing or answering your questions. Thank you. Thank you so much, Claudia. We want to thank you so much for your excellent presentation. She is a pioneer on family restorative process and restorative process for problem solving. That's how we met. Are there any questions for Claudia? Yes. Do we have any questions? Would you like to make any comments on your presentation? Yes, thank you, everyone. From the bottom of my heart, I want to thank everyone, the Ibero University, and I just wanted to share how important it is to practice restorative justice in the family environment. And this has to do with the criminal scenario where I've been working with Violeta, and we are looking at victims in many of the cases of people being victims right in their own family. These families I found in mediation processes, and that wasn't enough. I realized they had been victims not only in the present but also in the past. They were not aware of how they had been increasingly becoming victims in the family through their daughters, boys and girls. So violence became a normal thing for them. I was terribly impacted. The work we did in the circle to support women in these restorative programs, we can have these practices, this perfect accompaniment to approach this type of problem, re-victimization, to generate identity. And this is the message I've tried to share with you today from ourselves. We have to have this gender perspective from our own way of seeing things for us to have a different way of living and helping so many women, so many sisters that are suffering this, and everything we've done. And how is it that violence has become normal in families? And why is this happening? Because violence is possible at the family level. That's where everything starts. The violence against sisters, mothers, and that's why the crime rate is increasing so much. I wanted to share this with you to talk about the importance of opening the door at the family level to look into cases in a preventive manner and thus be able to offer a door solving these wounds we are suffering. That's what I wanted to convey. Incentivize and ask you to be united to open all the necessary doors so that we can look into reasons for violence becoming a normal thing. Yes, we have a question. Which are the main confusions on restorative justice and gender perspective? And how does this affect the processes you're mentioning? This is an excellent question. We have to remember that not long ago, we see how common is to mistake problem solving with restorative justice, even when we talk about gender perspective in restorative processes. It's important for us to understand this and to understand we have important international instruments with alternative methods for gender violence. We cannot see conflict solving the same as restorative justice. This is causing a lot of harm because we have to open doors as restorative justice for scenarios where a lot of damage is taking place. We have to talk about things we know and highlight. It's like thinking that a cantaloupe or a melon is a watermelon, but they are not the same. They're different fruits. People think that the melon is just the same as the watermelon because they've only tasted the melon. And this is the type of confusion we have. We have a structural solution in restorative justice, but we are closing doors on women. We are not placing them to negotiate with people who have classified them as victims. We're not just limiting ourselves to certain interventions. We want to generate accompaniment to identify the first super difficult step in this restorative process in the family. We have to see where the damage is. Multiple forms of damage, diverse damage. We have to open the map and also the compass for us to understand. Alternative problem solving methods do not allow for this. It is possible to apply this with a gender perspective. That is, it is possible to have restorative justice and practices assigned to the role of women because of gender issues. And out of the 4 women in the circle that I showed you, more than one had been depersonified, saying you're a bad mother. You don't have your children with you. So this is this gender stereotype and classifying the woman as a good or bad person according to her custody of the children. This is a chain saying you're not a good mother, you're not a good mother, you're not a good person. This is a chain of things. So anything that happens to you, all the violence is something you deserve. That's why they continue killing us. And there's a high rate of femicides in Mexico because violence is so normalized in this country. The family members become the attackers and they judge the woman because of gender perspective. There's no mediation, there's no negotiation, and this is causing a lot of harm. We need to accompany women and to look into the harm they are suffering. Thank you. 2 more questions. Who are the facilitators in those circles? on restorative justice? How are they trained? Thank you. The proposal of this model is one, for the facilitator to have training, first level training on restorative justice, methodology of restorative justice, and practices on restorative practices, the restorative approach. This facilitator has to have this training, how to approach the restorative paradigm. It is not enough to be a mediator. Training to work in a conflict is one thing, and training to be in a restorative process is a different thing altogether. When we talk about families, we have to look at the community, the school levels, but sometimes they are not as important as in the family environment. The person needs theory of complex thought that I explained to you at the social and family levels to understand the structure and the impact this has. It's important for that person, for the facilitator, to learn other social sciences, communication, pedagogic, psychiatric, psychological information. This is very important for facilitators. I'm not talking about superhuman beings. I'm talking about a person with minimum tools of other social sciences to map out the conflict and identify damage. I wish I could tell you there are many facilitators, but this is a door I'm pushing at the International Center. I started at the judicial branch in the state of Mexico as a mediator and facilitator with families. Costa Rica, there I had the opportunity of sharing this with them, and they are about to enact their family code with restorative practices, limiting this only for criminal cases. But now, in their jurisdictional processes, they're going to be including family restorative justice. And some other groupings have also shown interest on this with the intention of having this training. And I want to thank Violeta. She's participating with me. We want to continue training people to be facilitators. You will realize that a lot of the things and criminal issues, things come late when the victim is already there. We cannot turn her back, and we have to accompany the victim. We want peace in the families, and that's something I'm very convinced of. Thank you. In 1 or 2 weeks, we're going to be sharing information about the circles and restorative justice. Then we go to different lines that are quite specific. One is the family line. And the person I've been talking about in this project is Claudia. So we are going to be sharing information with you. We'll give you dates about the project. Another question. Can you share example of boys, girls, and adolescents in restorative justice? Yes. Under the same example of this circle, with the participation of 4 women in different restorative processes. In the practices we've designed of family restorative justice, those with the participations of boys and girls and adolescents are practices based on behavioral and cognitive development. They're not invasive practices accompanying boys, girls, and adolescents according to their psychological, social, educational development. This is done through psychology and a free game therapy with games where the facilitator interacts playing with the boys and girls and adolescents with the purpose of the facilitator detecting areas of opportunity to detect the damage. So this is not a structured type of interview. This is not an expert's interview. Children are not being evaluated. They are not going through a test. This is not a test. Through games. And something very important that sometimes the courts are not able to do. The influence of the father on the child. In the interviews of the children before a judge, there's a manipulation in the speech or the discourse of the minor, but we have the free game method. It's very playful. Children don't even realize what they are expressing through the game. So any influence can be seen, expressed, and reflected through the game. Now, on what they are reflecting when they're playing, we realize the negative influence or manipulation and power areas. I have a box with games that I use to identify harm or damage, emotional damage or harm. We play with planes or dolls, and through those games, children start talking about their emotions. We also have a family that may be connected, so we connect little dolls with colors and they tell us who is who. We have puppets. People love puppets and they do this puppet theater where we can do theater with those children and puzzles are also very good for this. With teenagers, we use other tools based on their age group. With some teenagers, we've used songs. They express themselves. Why do they like a certain song? And then we use the same song with the parents. We find the message that their children are conveying through that song. That's the work we do with boys, girls, and adolescents. Thank you, Claudia. Another question. There are those who think restorative justice is mediation according to international instruments of a life free of violence. What is the difference? The fundamental difference is what I said a minute ago, accompaniment of the facilitator for the victim, different from a mediator in mediation process. In mediation, we have the principle of neutrality. As I said, we have a conflict in which there are two people responsible for a conflict and they interact. In restorative justice, we have a victim and the offender. That's another difference. Using that space, we give people the approach is also different. Now, in terms of restorative justice in the family circle, we identify who is the victim and who plays the role of the offender. We put right in the center of the intervention, the victim is right in the middle, and boys and girls, if that's the case. We also work with the offender because the offender usually has normalized violence. So the offender justifies his actions. So this responsibility is a path we have to work on. So that's the main difference. The fact those international instruments are used for mediation and reconciliation, that is right. They are prohibiting this because that could be a big risk for people, but restorative justice has previous work, different planning process, different work, different interventions of third parties. It's not only to facilitate, but it's even having a multidisciplinary team and tools to identify damage. And the second step after that will be looking for alternatives to repair damage. And here we can look for alternatives to repair damage. Even if the offender does not participate in the process, there are other ways we can help the victim, like the mirror circles, repositioning women even without the participation of the offender, because we're also taking power away from the offender if he's not participating. This accompaniment in mediation and conciliation are not present, and this is causing a lot of damage. Thank you, Claudia. Let's see my final remarks. At the beginning, I was telling you about the different types of circles. This model we apply has to do with the sentence circles, peace circles. One of the things we tried to do when we were looking at one of the initiatives for the Justice for Adolescents legislation, we were not allowed to do this. They said, do a pilot first. So we have the circles that might be used as an alternative mechanism or a restorative process after the teenage is sentenced. But you in the state of Mexico were the first ones to facilitate the sentence circle. Could you tell us about them? In the state of Mexico, you have been able to generate jurisprudence on them. Could you tell us about this Mexican model? Thank you. The truth is that this was a challenge. Thinking about it and implementing it, a very satisfactory challenge here in the state of Mexico. One of the things that was also very important is the first sentence circles in the state of Mexico were at the second instance in sentence circles with the participation of women justices and judges. This meant that the justice system structure, we started sensitizing from the top and then we went down to the lower levels with these practices. The women judges and the justices wanted to send cases for mediation. As a facilitator, I thought mediation re-victimizes the victim. We have to participate, but not through mediation, I said, because there were conditions that didn't allow me to work that way. So I started sharing with them the difference between mediation and restorative justice and everything we could do with the restorative justice. The main idea was to socialize them through my work and give them progress being made, give them information on this progress. So we sensitized the judges. They, as part of this structure of the judicial branch, were able to understand this. That way we can see how this can be used in a very positive manner. They were using their power to generate a multidisciplinary team because we didn't have this multidisciplinary group. So they said, we have to talk to the experts. We need a psychologist specializing in children, working with the facilitator, a social worker, working with a facilitator. What did I do? Well, the psychologist and the social worker are now socializing with restorative justice. That's how we started creating our team. We now have an agenda with the participation of 3 justices and the facilitators, also 3 women. We were able to do everything regarding a restorative approach, not an isolated approach, because this has been deformed. Everyone calls everything restorative justice, but this is not true. Not everything is restorative justice. We have to give it the right name. We had many cases under this perspective at the multidisciplinary level. Restorative justice, we socialized with attorneys. They were a very necessary element. And sometimes the cases had gone through the second instance with no appeal. We socialized this with the public prosecutor's office as well, representing minors. This was very important. We worked on this restorative approach and justice with everyone interested in working on this at the family level. So the result of this approach was that people were able to reach agreements. However, something I found was how important it is for them to be legitimized after everything they had done, a very difficult path repairing damage. So we had an agreement, not only on the emotional side or the commitment side, the ethical, moral commitment to improve their circumstances and their family environment. That's the most important aspect for me. Let us remember we had already started many legal elements, so we had to take them into account now. Knowing how important this was, especially for the adolescence legislation in Mexico, the multidisciplinary team started working with teenagers through this multidisciplinary group in the state of Mexico. So we used it at the family level with a different approach. So I spoke to the justices, telling them there was a possibility of a sentence circle generating decision making with restorative approach, where people would legitimate or legitimize their decisions. In all sentence circles where I participated, they had no idea. You have no idea, rather, of how important this was for people to tell the judges how they had decided over their own conflict. So women were being empowered, not only the women, but families and children even, and how they went to see the authority. We looked into this possibility, and in a hearing, we had a secretary, all the required staff for a hearing with the necessary authority to develop all the procedures under their responsibility for the superior interest of the minor. So these justices started this hearing, and restorative justice was not a second-hand thing. Its importance was granted through the facilitator in practice, and they were part of this work. So they were not just an authority, they were part of the community, and they were legitimizing everything that was going on. But the sentences were given by the families, and they were part of the circle in this democratic decision making. And the sentence was dictated, and we had a ceremony of opening, and none of those things were in disagreement with the legal scenario. We could were able to live, to coexist, and have convergence. One thing does not exclude the other. We were able to participate, all of us, through our own scope, for true justice to be served, in which people are taken into account. Judge not coming, rather, justice not coming from the judge, but with the participation of the victims. So, with this first attempt, we had marvelous sentences with everyone's participation in the process, and the family was involved. We have 13 jurisprudences with different issues. For instance, intervention of facilitator, restorative justice, sentence circles, and judges collaborating to create a multidisciplinary team through restorative justice, and being able to have restorative justice in case of family violence, because the justices were able to understand this is not the same as mediation, and there are victims here, and there was no answer given to the victims through a sentence. That's how we generated circles. I had the opportunity of doing this, participating in a double sentence circle because the family had two trials, two judges. So the restorative process had the possibility of finishing with the two trials. So that's what we did. This is the last one where I had the opportunity. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you, Claudia. Thank you so much. I want to thank everyone of Ibero University, Elvia, Jorge. Thank you so much, Claudia, for being our main activity this year. And I want to highlight how difficult it is to be someone so intelligent with your initiatives, with so much work and plans, with a gender perspective. It's difficult for a woman to reach where she is right now with so many accomplishments. You are a great example of that. Thank you so much. And thank you for being with us. I want to thank Elvia, Jorge, and I want to thank everyone participating in this marvelous conference organized by the Ibero University. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for such an excellent presentation. I want to thank Claudia for your excellent material and experiences you are sharing with us today. And it's very important for us to discuss issues related to restorative processes in family matters and support circle for women. Thank you. We're very happy. And we are meeting with you tomorrow at 9 a.m. We have a panel tomorrow, positive proposals to confront violence, racism, sexism, and LGBT plus phobias. Thank you, everyone. And we will see you tomorrow at 9 a.m. Good. Thank you for inviting us. Have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you, Claudia. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Ibero Americana University. Goodbye.